Welcome to Haunted Hills Podcast. I'm Tegan, the Ghost Whisperer. This episode shares the ghosts of Alton, Illinois. It was the first step on the Underground Railroad. And, firstly, as always, the indigenous nations of this land, as far as I know them to be, the Kickapoo, Kawasakia, Osage, Niaushi, Miamia, Quapaw, and Ochechi Saquin. Thank you to all the people who shared their stories with me to make this episode, and those who were brave enough to write them in papers that long ago stopped printing. If you want to share your ghost story with me, send me an email, hauntedhillstours@gmail.com. Firstly, the reason these stories are important to me is that ghosts were people once. It's fascinating to learn about how they lived, what they did. Their presence gives us a glimpse into the lives of the regular people in these towns. You don't have to believe in ghosts to enjoy the narrative. Not all spectres are fearsome and angry. Some just want to communicate. After all, they were people. It's not as though death steals our humanity. Usually the circumstances of our life, or choices we make, do that. And that's a different kind of story that haunts me. For ad-free listening, join us on patreon.com/hauntedhills for as little as $2 a month. And join the other wonderful people already there. Mick W. from the Latrobe Valley Paranormal Detectives, Colin B., Dale, Kath H., Lisa M., and Fred's Frog. In Walhalla, the south side of town tour, you will hear about the sawmill, abattoir, coach house, Stringer's Creek, tennis courts, and the cemetery, even a brewery, all through the people who lived there. It's told in the style of an on-location tour, but as with all digital recordings, you can listen to it wherever you are. The 55-minute audio tour talks you through the location using an MP3 sharing the history of Walhalla, which is not on the historical boards found around town. You can purchase the Walhalla Southside Town Tour at hauntedhillstours.com.au/shop for $10 Australian. There are also 3 publicly available episodes you can listen to on any podcast player, covering the history, crime, and ghosts of Walhalla. Today I have Bex from Tutia Bruja, a series about brujeria, witchcraft, ghosts, and the abnormal from the perspective of people with melanin. Thanks for joining me today, Bex.
Thanks for having me again, Tegan. I think this is the 3rd time I've been here. Yes, okay. So I'm so happy to be here.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, we really love having you here. And Alton, Illinois was your suggestion today. I've looked into a little bit of it, but I know that this was something you suggested. What is it about Alton that interests you?
So, okay, I grew up in Florissant, which is right across the bridge from Alton. So growing up, I went there a lot. I don't know why, but my mom always really enjoyed going there. Maybe it's its historic charm. Maybe it's its creepy vibe. I don't know. But as a kid, pretty much every weekend, we would go to Alton. We'd have dinner. We'd hang out there. Because my mom was such a, housewife. So during the week she would cook, and then weekends were her time to rest. So her choice was always to go find a restaurant in Alton to check out. So I was very familiar with it as a child. And then I was always a creepy kid, morbid topics, ghosts, anything like that. Even though it scared me, I loved it. And so pretty early on, I started being aware of its history. It has a very huge history. They do tours there. They do ghost tours there. And it's one of those things that it has such a complex history, because I don't know if you realize this. Well, I'm sure we'll get into it a little bit later. But Alton was essentially, when people were enslaved, if you could make it to Alton, Illinois, you were free, because Missouri was a state that was pro-slavery. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff there. So it was the beginning of the Underground Railroad. So, that just sort of sets you up for a lot of sad and tragic and, scary events. So I feel like that's sort of what brings the energy. But yeah, and you know me, my show, Bruja, is all about ghosts and paranormal and brujeria and just all of these various things, so it just kind of fit. I actually thought about buying a house there at one point too. I don't know if I'd mentioned that to you. Yeah, it didn't work out just because the housing market is a mess here stateside right now. I can't speak for everywhere else, but here for sure it's wild. I actually recorded an episode of my podcast about sort of the situation. It was called They Killed and Buried People There. And so the reason that I mentioned this is because, again, it's a creepy town. I had looked at this place. My partner had looked at this place. Like, we just really liked it. But then when I showed it to my mom, who sort of has the gift, like she's very aware of spirits and she has all these ghost stories she can tell you. But she looked at that place and was just sort of like, that place freaks me out. Like, I don't like it. I feel like they killed and buried people there. And I kind of laughed it off. But then the next day I went to a showing, and I'm not going to lie to you, I had a really strange feeling. And there was you walked to a certain point and you felt like something was watching you. And then the realtor that we were working with at the time, like, walked past and showed us the very back. And there was this very large industrial sink, which was kind of weird because they had another like sink that was used for, I guess, like cleaning and stuff, next to the washing machine. So this was in the very back. And I think the thing that made me scared is that they had like an industrial paper towel holder, like not just a rack of paper towels, but like a whole like thing you had to pull out and fill with paper towels. And I'm like, why are you going through that many paper towels?
Yeah, that sounds really unnerving. Just you telling that story, it sounds very creepy because, yeah, why do you need like an industrial sink and that many paper towels?
And kind of like, yeah, the hidden part of the closet. And there were just all these little areas that had like strange nooks and crannies where you would like walk through and you would think it would just sort of be a hallway and there'd be all these rooms off of it. And it was like, and then the way it was set up in the basement too was like, part of it looked like, okay, you could host like a drink with someone if you wanted a nightcap, right? Like you could have a nightcap on this side, on the right side of the garage or of the basement. But then if you kind of walked around, it was like kind of hard to leave. And I was like, oh no. And then my dad and I went upstairs because he's the one who went with me to see it. We went upstairs and we were looking at the backyard, and it was just, there was kind of connected to the woods. Part of the property had like a little entry in the woods. And it's funny because I think one of those things about like being bilingual and being in spaces where you have a lot of monolingual people. So my dad and I speak Spanish and we just look at each other and he was like, your mom was right. And I'm like, I think so too.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was just very unnerving. And so it's one of those things that I'm like, I don't know what it is about that town, but it's creepy.
Yeah, definitely. There is such a rich history there. And yeah, that house sounds extra creepy, especially also like spiritual side aside. That just sounds like a place that you would be, if you heard something go bump in the night and you weren't sure it was paranormal or a person, how would you be able to find anybody in all those nooks and crannies?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Both ways would have, yeah, probably a good choice to have skipped that one.
Yeah.
Housing is a bit crazy over here too. A friend was going to see a house yesterday, and before she got there, she was called and told that it was sold. So yeah, the housing market's moving really fast. I think it seems to be a fairly consistent story wherever you go at the moment, which is really odd because it's not usually so the same.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Alton definitely feels like the tale of two cities, like because it's divided by the Mississippi River. And the other side of it is St. Louis, Missouri. That's where they upheld the slave state, whereas Alton was, like you said, the freedom place where you would be free. Although it wasn't that simple, and nothing ever is it? Because even in Alton, Illinois, while slavery was not the law, there were people who believed that Black people should be enslaved. And then there were the abolitionists who believed freedom is an unalienable right of every person. The division and dissent lasts to this day. It almost seems like it's etched into the granite and the ground there, along with the regular reasons that people stay and haunt a town. Alton, Illinois is America's most haunted small town. Paranormal researchers also believe the limestone beneath Alton causes a stone recording of the traumas that were experienced of the town. So, let's discover spirits that linger, the place's trauma is embedded, and the spectres living their best afterlife. So the division of the town of Alton was so great it led to the murder of Elijah Parrish Lovejoy. He was a preacher, a journalist, and a slave abolitionist. One of the things he published was this. It's a quote from him. He says, "Abolitionists believe that as all men are born free, so all who are now held as slaves in this country were born free. and that they are slaves now is the sin, not of those who introduced the race into this country, but of those and those alone who now hold them and have held them in slavery from their birth. Elijah, by a lottery of birth, was born into a white family in 1804 in Albion, Maine, USA. His father was determined to give his children the best education and best start for life, so he sent them to the best schools, which gave them the space to do the education, allowing Elijah to go to college, finishing in the top of his class in 1826. He started out as a journalist in the pool of the St. Louis Times in 1827, until he worked his way to editor, where he quit in 1883. He pursued his own newspaper for his activism for abolition of slavery. He called it the St. Louis Observer. The pro-slavery state and the people of Missouri did not appreciate his views at all. It may have been his writing of this. Emancipation, what does it mean? Simply that the slaves shall cease to be held as property and shall henceforth be held and treated as human beings. Simply that we should take our feet from off their necks. They harassed him, and the intensity grew until he was hounded out of St. Louis in 1836, where he moved to Alton. He renamed the paper the Alton Observer, which was an anti-abolitionist newspaper again. So rumors started around the town that the hard times being experienced were as a result of the talk against slavery. So people in Alton even began to torment him. Elijah wrote, "If I've been guilty of no violation of law, why am I hunted up and down continually like a partridge upon the mountains? Why am I threatened with the tar barrel? Why am I waylaid every day from night to night, and my life in jeopardy every hour?" The separation of the river didn't stop the pro-slavery people coming to make him be quiet. Elijah wrote, "I have concluded after consultation with my friends and earnestly seeking counsel of God to remain at Alton, and here to insist on protection in the exercise of my rights." They had destroyed 4 of his printing presses by this time, including one that was on the banks of the Mississippi River the night that he decided to move to Alton. And it seems that the pro-slavery mob wasn't just happy enough to hound him and try and make him be quiet. It appears it demanded a blood sacrifice. The pro-slavery people went around his warehouse that was on William Street near the Alton Military Prison, where a shootout ensued. Lives were lost on both sides, but it did take Elijah Parrish Lovejoy. He was killed on the 7th of November, 1837. He was 34, struck down in the prime of his life. There was a trial against the people who shot him at the warehouse, even though some of them did die in the standoff. After killing him, they set fire to the warehouse, destroying much of his work. However, it's said his legacy and spirit lives on in Alton. People sensitive to the paranormal hear gunshots echo around the site of the old warehouse. They say they see his apparition wandering, watching the printing press, ruminating on what he was publishing, watching and making sure the print was completed and sent out. He may still even walk the streets delivering the newspaper, because his very own calling may not have let him rest. His own words say, "The cry of the oppressed has entered not only into my ears, but into my soul, so that while I live, I cannot hold my peace." What do you think, Bex?
I wouldn't be surprised if Elijah still walks that space. To be killed in the time of your prime, and especially when you're just trying to do the right thing and have people be treated well, it's so sad. So sad.
Definitely. And it's such a big thing. Like it doesn't, like, given what we know about today, it doesn't take too much of an imagination to understand the kind of divide that was still happening, even if the law didn't say slavery was a practice.
Yeah. And it's wild. I just thought of something while you were telling the story about his printing press and everything. I think of maybe 7 years back ago or something. I think it was circa 2015. They actually found one of his printing presses. Had been tossed into the river or something like that. And
yes.
Yeah.
They did. They got it. That's awesome because that was the one that was on the banks waiting to be carted across.
Yeah. So,
wow.
I think there's some sort of poetic justice there. It's it made it after all.
That is amazing. Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
Yeah. And I don't I'm so curious, like because I feel like when the Underground Railroad was something that was in effect, there were all these people who took part. And I kind of wonder if he was someone who was very active in making that happen or knew about it or, because obviously that's such a secreted thing, right? You can only tell people you trust because then it's a whole debacle.
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally. So he actually dies 5 years before it officially begins. So
Ah,
the official recording of it is 1842 and he dies in 1837. But
mm,
yeah, I do have a bit, but I do believe his writings and his courage did spur on the people who would come later.
yeah. So it's interesting too because a lot of those tunnels are still there.
Yes,
One
because
of
we're
the
going to
ghosts.
talk about that.
Oh, are we? Okay, because one thing I wanted to, and you can kind of do whatever you would like with this information. But one of the ghost tours, the walking one, it takes you to this house that, because of course every haunted building at one point, especially if it's a huge house, right? Like it had to be a tuberculosis hospital. It was a
Yeah.
leper like hospital, I think at one point too, or I guess colony, because I guess you can't really treat that anyway, but it was a space where just all of these intense things happened. And in the basement, now it's a bunch of apartment complex. It's been converted. But when they do tours, they take you to the basement and it's part of the tunnels that were part of the Underground Railroad. And they've been blocked off now. But I had something really creepy happen to me in one of them. So, yeah.
Do
Can I
tell.
yeah, you
Yeah.
wanna okay, so, we went down there and our guide was like, "I'm gonna turn off the lights, like, some people report having experiences down here, we'll see what happens," because it was so active at one point. I went with my boyfriend and we were down there, and those light bulbs that are green, like, they give off kind of that iridescent kinda glow, like, after
Yeah.
you turn them off? Okay, so there were one of those down there, so the light had turned off, it kinda still was giving a little bit of a green glow, and I was looking at it. Something about it was like comforting, especially being in the dark in a place I don't know with a bunch of people I don't know. And I looked down for just a brief second and then I looked back up and it was completely dark, totally dark, super dark. And I was like looking at it for a few minutes and I was like, I wonder how long we're going to be down here. Just thinking to myself, we were probably down there for like a total of 10 minutes. We were probably in the dark for a total of 4 or 5. And so looked at it, looked back down, looked back up and it was green again. So there was something blocking it for a second. And then
Oh.
maybe 20 seconds max after that, whatever was there was no longer there. Someone screamed and insisted that their hair was yanked. So I just thought that was very creepy.
Definitely. So that was the Enos Sanitarium, or originally it was called Hanson Mansion. It was
Mhm.
built in 1857 by Nathaniel Hanson, who was an abolitionist. And that's a really fascinating thing about the lights because the way that he would signal to the people crossing the Mississippi River, because they had to change the location of where they would come through, because they used to come through on the ferry. But then the slave bounty hunters came through and started, doing their work to try and recapture people who were trying to escape. Plus, the volume of people had increased a lot by then, which is why those tunnels are so big because they needed somewhere safe to put them while they tried to work out ways out of town that wasn't, highly noticeable. So they would organize different kinds of transport with different kinds of people going different places to just get them out safely so that they wouldn't be caught and also unobscured. So they could spend a little bit of time by this time in those tunnels. It was built on purpose, so it's high above the Mississippi River where you can see it, and that it used to have nothing obstructing it. So it used to be just his grounds all the way to the Mississippi River. And it was built to take the place of the first stop on the Underground Railroad. He used a lantern system at the front of his house to say when the coast was clear and when it wasn't. So depending on how his lights were set up, and this changed regularly, he was signaling to people. The ferry and terminal were no longer a viable option. Under the cover of darkness, they would cross the Mississippi. He would pick them up in a covered wagon and take them to his home. Many of the haunting experiences here are residual haunts, except for that one you just said. In 1911, it was turned into a quarantine health facility for people with TB, or tuberculosis, which is a bacterial infection of the lungs, which had no treatment in 1911, and people were treated palliatively. People came to die in agony as their lungs failed, a struggle many would fight for 5 years, their final months spent at that place. Strange happenings are reported by the residents of the Enos apartments today. Toilets flush on their own, strange smells permeate the hallways, footsteps when no one else is around, and sometimes even screaming. That's amazing that you had an experience there too.
Yeah, I'm telling you, ghosts love finding me. Like, I don't know what it is, but they always do. Or maybe I go finding them. I don't know. Either way. But yeah, so that house that you're talking about, I've been there. It's a bunch of apartments now. It's been converted.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's and I think that that's not really hard to find in Alton. Like, buildings get converted into other buildings all the time. One we had talked about before this recording was the Milton Schoolhouse, and that's a coffee shop now.
Yes. Yeah. It was built in 1904 as a schoolhouse. And as we talked about before the recording, it's on the completely opposite side of town to the old part of Alton, where the military prison is and where the Enos Sanitarium is and where the warehouse is. So it's far on the other side of town, but it's haunted as well. And there's a number of businesses operating in it, including that coffee shop. And apparently it's one of the most haunted places in Alton. What was your favorite story from that place?
The Milton Schoolhouse?
Yeah, from the Milton Schoolhouse.
So it's interesting because there's lore, right? There's lore to why it's haunted, but nobody can give a precise reason as to why. But there is the story that I am familiar with. I wouldn't say it's my favorite necessarily, but it's the one that I know, is that there is a young girl named Mary who was murdered and assaulted in the building, and the janitor, people had sort of suspected that it was him. He had taken some weeks off school and, just a whole lot of suspicious things. And then eventually he ended up taking his own life in the basement. There's no truth to that, though. It's interesting. There is a gentleman. His name is Troy Taylor. If you haven't checked him out, please do. He's a horror historian. He's great. He writes all of these different things. I guess he's also like a paranormal investigator. So he does a lot of research and the legwork on figuring out like, okay, well, what happened here? Are there documents to verify that? And that's one that he has said is not true, but many people it closed in the 90s. So, a lot of people since then have said that they've heard voices. They're like, listen, I don't believe in ghosts, most people have an experience there. The only thing that I could say that
Hey, thanks so much for listening to Haunted Hills Podcast. Did you know our Patreons over at patreon.com/Haunted Hills don't listen to ads for as little as $2 a month? Plus, they get the bonus episode for every month they're released. As you give more support, your listening is enhanced by even more. At the $7.50 tier, you get access to the past 6 months bonus episodes. And the premium patrons at $15 a tier get exclusive content and the entire catalogue of our entire year of listening. Plus, exclusive invites to the discussions and joining me on the podcast. You can keep listening for free, and we appreciate that too. Just share us with your friends. The more people that support Haunted Hills means the more episodes that will come out if we meet the targets. You can check out the targets at patreon.com/Haunted Hills.
Troy Taylor, he did a series on that or whatever. And also he does his first season. If podcasts are something you enjoy, he did a whole first season of Alton. He is from the Illinois area. And so he covers the Milton Schoolhouse. He covers all these different places. And I'm sure he could also do like a second season of haunted places in Alton, because like I said, there are so many, so many.
Yeah, definitely. So things that people experience at the schoolhouse are the sound of children, just as though that's kind of been etched into the building. But there's other ones that are a little bit more unnerving, I'd say. You know, noticing items moving as though hovering with nobody intervening. There's also that uneasy feeling of being watched. And so, yeah, like you said, many people will have an experience of some kind. And yes, you might even see an apparition of an older woman walking the halls who could be a grandmother or just an older teacher. So, yeah, the Milton School was a really interesting place because, yeah, it really doesn't seem to have a reason to be as haunted as it is.
And I think that those are always the most interesting because it's like, yeah, you know, when something has happened, it's very linear. It's like, okay, well, this happened there. People have experienced weird things there. Like, we know why. But when you have no idea, I don't know, it's just so much scarier. Like, you're just like imagining, you know, like what happened that people just had no idea about, right? And that's scary in itself. Or is it something like not of this earth? Is it a portal? Like, who knows, you know?
Yeah, definitely. There is a number of things that it could be, especially because, yeah, it's the newer part of town. It's not, yeah, like newer as in not 1830.
Yeah. And I know we had talked about this previously, and to bring up Troy Taylor again, because he did a whole season on the St. Louis Exorcist, which, like you said earlier, is not that far from, you know, the river separates it, but it's not that far. But he did a whole, I think it was like 8-part series on what he thinks happened and how the situation got worse, just by speaking to everyone and having all those sides. And you just have to think, like, what is in that area, you know, that is, it seems like some sort of portal, right? Like some sort of way for us to communicate with the undead and just things that are beyond this realm. Like, what is it? What is it about this place? And there are a lot of places like that, sure. But I don't know, being here, the energy just feels different, for lack of a better term. Yeah.
Oh, definitely. Because another one of the places right next to where Elijah Parrish Lovejoy was murdered is the Alton Military Prison, which was opened in 1833. Well, it opened originally as just a normal prison, and it was built by the first warden and 2 prisoners that he boarded in his home. The work was done in silence, which was a tactic of prison management called the Auburn Plan, which is to be working in silence. It's an extension kind of solitary confinement, including even when you are with others. And they think it's a rehabilitative tactic, which I have questions. When it was completed at that stage, it had 24 rooms. It was a very tough prison and is a reportedly haunted location. The next warden in 1835, while watching men break rocks, part of the hard labor aspect of their punishment, he placed a rifle on a rock. When it slipped, the rifle engaged and a bullet discharged into his body. Buckshots also took off links of his chain to his pocket watch. He died there in the yard. No prisoners were charged with the murder. This warden could still be there haunting the grounds in the quarry. By 1836, it was overcrowded. There were 622 male prisoners, 23 female prisoners. They were illiterate, intemperate, and abstinent from alcohol, is how the paper reported them. In 1841, they built more cells. It was closed for the public use, or as a public prison, in 1860. They reopened it a few years later for the Civil War to house traitors and Confederate soldiers. Both these locations are on William Street in Alton. The stone building at its peak had 256 rooms with dimensions 4 by 7 foot, which at its highest volume of people housed 12,000 people. Disease ran rife, adding to the misery and pain of the prison. This was just in the space of 3 years. With the lack of space, privacy, and liberty, along with other conditions, malnourishment, a lack of blanket and warm clothes, along with unsanitary conditions, led to dysentery. It also created the perfect conditions for viral and bacterial diseases like influenza and smallpox. So just quickly, what is the kind of climate around the Alton area? Like, how bad would it have been to have been there in a stone building in winter without proper clothes or blankets?
Oh, it would have been bad. Just because, I mean, Alton and Florissant are 20 minutes apart, right? So the weather, 20, 30 minutes apart. So the weather is it's because of how the weather is now and global warming. I feel like the winters aren't as bad as they used to be. I mean, you'll have days where it'll get below what it is in Antarctica, right? So, and that's on record. The last couple of summers have been, or the last couple, sorry, not summers, the last couple of winters have been so cold that it was colder in Antarctica at times. So that gives you perspective, and that's now. So I can only imagine back then they would get a lot more snow, because that is something I do remember a lot more of as a kid as opposed to now. But yikes, those poor men. And also, just for perspective, you said there were 1,200 or 12,000?
12,000.
Okay, so let me tell you, as someone who's walked around that space, there's not a whole lot of it left. Like, there's maybe just a little, like, they have like a little memorial like thing for it. But if that's the case and it was that large and it hosted that many people, well, that explains why Alton's haunted, because there's a bunch of other things and businesses and stuff around there, right? So it's like, it's so strange, sometimes, like, to have the new eyes of a city and be like, I have no idea why that place is haunted. But then, when you get a lot of this information, being ignorant, but in the space and where it happened, you're kind of like, oh, that checks out.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, that's so terrible. But like, it's also like, can you imagine the suffering of that many men? Like,
no, and like that's the thing, that when I was researching it, I was looking into it and I was just trying to imagine that, because like right now the only context that I have is coronavirus, being locked down, trying to stop the spread of this awful thing that's happening. But in a place where you couldn't do that, and you, like, they did originally try to stop the spread of smallpox, so they did move those people to a hospital, which is now unable to be accessed because it's flooded. It's in the Alton Dam, which was made in 1926.
Smallpox Island is what they call it. Yeah.
Yes.
Was a little space off. Yeah. It's funny. Also a funny story, like, about how people reuse things. So that was used for that. And then it used to be a lot larger, so people would go and kind of maybe camp on it. And off the top of my head, I can't speak to the size of how big it was, but I know it was so much larger at one point, and now it's sort of eroded to nothing. But like you said, you can't go there anymore. I've actually never seen it. I would like to maybe get on a boat and do that, future goals. But but oh man, it's so wild, I'm sorry, but I'm having this whole like revelation, because it's so wild sometimes when you do speak, of places that people have never had the opportunity to go to, and you are so familiar, and you're like, oh yeah, that's why. That's
why. No, that's okay, because that's kind of the thing about me doing the research and you being here. That's the whole thing. It's awesome.
And so I'm really glad that we're able to have this experience, so I can convey to you, it's like, it's not great.
yeah, definitely. Oh, it couldn't be, because like that place, like, because by the end of it, Bex, they didn't even try to remove them anymore. They ended up quarantining the whole facility and keeping the guards in there, as well as the wardens, as well as the prisoners. And this would have broken the men, because their cries can still be heard at night at that location, and sometimes even the stench of bodies, because at the height of the quarantine, they just lined the bodies up at the fence, and some were buried on site. But before they got the chance to bury them, they were dying faster than they could. Oh. So these men would have been completely broken, absolutely devastated with their own pain, coldness, numbness, unwellness, and just lack of health from being in this environment where they had no privacy, no space. And, they would have never even gotten to really reconcile what came after the war, because many of them didn't even survive. So they would have felt betrayed and angry. And sometimes when you're there, you might feel that too. The Confederates were the pro-states' rights people, or the people who felt it was the right way to run an economy on slave labor. But they were still people, and this was no way to live or die under such brutal conditions. Disembodied lights are also seen at this location. After the war, it was bought, and many of the stones were removed. Today, after some restoration in 1973, there is a wall left that you can visit with that memorial that you were speaking of. But yeah, it's like really intense. Like, just, that would have been so terrible, because these were like your comrades who you'd fought with beside. and you'd survived the battlefield only to lose them to disease and illness in a really horrendous prison.
Yeah. It's so wild because that's in downtown Alton, which is where, all of the different things that you spoke of, except for the Milton School, have been, where Elijah was murdered, just all these different things. And it's like, I will say, because when you do a ghost tour, at least in my experience, you just focus on the downtown area because it's the most active. It's the one that's had people for the longest time, that is like documented. But also there's just like so much more, right? Like because being so close to the river, it was like an ideal place for people to grow a city. So, it was colonized, all the different like things that happened to the indigenous people. It's just like, it's one of those things that like, unfortunately, we only sometimes get like the whitewashed part of ghost stories and paranormal and all that stuff. And not to say that this event isn't traumatic and whatnot, but, imagine what happened even before we can document. So it's just like the land, it speaks for itself.
Oh, completely. I completely hear that too. Because I did try to find out who were the traditional owners of the land before treaties and all that kind of stuff. And yeah, that was really quite challenging to find. And I also noticed that many tribes seem to overlap with their ownership of land because they don't really own it. They're more, I don't know, it's how they use the land.
They lived it. Yeah.
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 So it's a different concept even again. And yes, we didn't really well document our horrificness. Like to find all that, you have to go back through letters that people write to other people where they just be too candid to state what they've done. And then but also to actually listen and hear the stories passed down through the generations of those people who lost family members and who survived a attempted genocide. Like, yeah, so I think, yeah, you're right. Like there is a lot that needs to still be discovered about even before we colonized, like as we were colonizing, how we did that and how things, the relationship that those spirits have to the place as well, given that they were killed for land.
Yeah. So I don't know. This is just to say, like, and especially through the eyes of like what you need to develop a space, right? You need water, and the Mississippi is full of it. And so I imagine, and there was a time where it was drinkable, because you've never been here, but let me tell you, we call it the muddy Mississippi for a reason. It's but so it's just like, that would make sense. And so that you understand that, like, so that was a place that was colonized. So there are probably energies just before we even understand all the ghost stories that we know now. You know what I mean?
Definitely. Yeah. That there's stories that we just don't know. And also maybe can't even conceptualize because they're different to the way we conceptualize our ghost stories. Because, different places have different focuses on what the paranormal entities are doing or what they want. Whereas a lot for us, it's, the feeling of unease and being watched, which maybe we need.
Yeah. Also, because I was curious, and I was like, I don't think I know any of the nations that, the indigenous nations that sort of were part of the area or lived there. But then I remembered, the Osage, because Cahokia Mounds in Cahokia isn't that far, I believe. It's in Illinois. I think it's a little bit further out, more closer to the St. Louis side, like right across, as opposed to Alton. But I'm sending you an email of all the different nations for you to check out. There's this really cool website called native-land.ca, which is a great resource for finding. Mind you, it's not the end all be all, but it is a great way to start to learn who were people who lived in that area. And so, it is important to recognize that we just had, Indigenous Peoples Day. And so it's, as someone who comes from, is a descendant of Indigenous people, I'm not close enough myself to say that I'm an Indigenous person. But, I think it's important to get in touch with those roots, in addition to understand and learn about the people who are there who have descendants to this day. You know what I mean?
Oh, definitely. No, I agree. So thanks for that email. That'll be awesome, because I will add it at the start of my introduction to the podcast, because that's what I like to do with all the places. But I found it really hard with Alton to find the places because I just use Google and then sometimes it doesn't give it to me what I'm looking for, and so I will love that website to just keep referring to it because some of them I found they do they highlight the area of the town that it's in and then show me how many people, like the kinds of Indigenous nations that were there, which is handy because I really appreciate that information. Because I think we need to tell the full story because, we need to be looking at how we can, look at mending, if not doing more than mending that kind of thing that's happened because, people, and it has created disparity from that moment on that echoes into today. So we do need to look at fixing
all
it.
sides of everything. Yeah, it's important, I think, in the human experience, and I think for me, it's easier to understand ghosts if I can understand trauma, and I think that that's also the reason why people either can see spirits or ghosts or they can't. I think that's an issue that's pretty there's a pretty fine line. It's you either you do and you believe that something like that could be possible, or you are on the completely other spectrum and you're no, I cannot believe, I do not understand, whatever. But I think we also have to understand humanity and trauma and the levels of trauma that can happen. And I think that sometimes when you've had a lot of disparity and you've had a lot of terrible things, we are a spirit with a flesh suit. No matter how people feel about whatever, I understand that people are oh, I don't want to believe that there's something beyond this or whatever. And I'm and that's fair. And that's your, you can do that. But you cannot deny to the other people like myself who have had these experiences, who know that it's there, that, we may not be able to explain it. And maybe some people can, I don't know. I think that that's an interesting conversation to have too, because something that I just learned, I'm sorry, I'm having a whole thing about Indigenous people, but as we should, it was just Indigenous Peoples Day. But in America, when they were doing the process of the residual boarding schools and taking Indigenous children and having them go through that to strip away their culture and whatnot, another major aspect was the development of mental health. And so a lot of spiritual leaders who had the ability to speak to spirit were basically told that they were going through psychosis. And so they were taken and stripped from the culture. And it's how do you break someone down? You take away every part of them and tell them that it's not worthy or that there's something wrong with it. And that's essentially what happened to Indigenous people. They took away the languages, they took away their spiritual leaders, they took away their way of life, the ability to just move and freely go. And you live here in the winter and you live there in the summer, and because you realize migration patterns, right? And that's how they lived. And and so it's it's very understandable. So I think it's one of those things to kind of circle back to. I think if you've seen those levels of trauma, and I think if you've seen those levels of just terrible things and violence and abuse and all these different things, right? If you have seen that, you are more aware of things. And therefore, for me, I understand that I feel if you are a human who experienced all these things, it's possible that your soul was withered away to nothing and you don't care what's next because you've already experienced the worst of it, and so you stay. And, I think that that's different for other people. I think that sometimes you hear stories of spirits who, it was a young girl who died in a very tragic way, and maybe she is trying to rectify because, again, I'm no expert. From what it seems like, though, spirits, the reason that they're stuck here is they can't get past it. And it seems like they just keep reliving it, right? They're almost in their minds. I don't know if mind's the right word, but they are reliving it, trying to see if they can change it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they can't. They're just living the same constant reality. They're stuck in that timeline. They can't go to whatever the next thing is. So I don't know. Ghosts are just fascinating. So I just want to thank you so much for, one, bringing me on and letting me babble about, Indigenous people. But again, as we all should, Indigenous Peoples Day just happened. But two, being able to talk about all these ghost stories somewhere so close to me, because it's just a really creepy town. And I feel if anybody's listening that gets the opportunity to go to Alton, Illinois, please go and explore it. There's a lot of open shop fronts. There's a lot of that town needs a lot of love, I think.
Yeah.
It's difficult to get it.
Definitely. And I think, like, yeah, echoing the that is definitely a major paranormal theory, is that people are stuck, that ghosts are there as, yeah, trying to rectify or fix what went wrong. But I do think, like, what you've said is something that actually I just was reminded that a lot of the ghost stories are of white women in our culture, because I think it's the same reason we're more going to discuss the missing white woman than we are an Indigenous woman, or, a Black woman, because, that's where we've made that Madonna and that dichotomy of the good and the bad. And we still haven't really gotten past that. And I think we really do need to consider these things, because this is also impacting our storytelling and our ability to connect with people who have different experiences that could share us so much more. Because, like, if we have done the wrong thing by people telling them that their mental health is harmed because of their traditional cultural practices or their spiritual connectedness that's higher than ours or different to ours, then, that has a different meaning, then we're not really learning. We're just trying to make it fit into boxes we created, which is more colonization and all those things that is just continued to harm, which is one of the things that we really do need to be looking at and considering when we're looking at, even just ghosts and ghost stories. Like, how are we telling people's story, and are we doing justice by it? Because, yeah, I could not find a single story that might have represented a person who was not white in this. Or maybe there were Black people as well, because I think some of them have been left behind as residual, like, just their fear of, like, not knowing if they would make it out of those tunnels. I think that might be etched in there. And also the boredom that they would have felt being in there for, it could have been up to weeks in the end, when such a volume of people was coming across, because they needed to get them out, like I said earlier, in ways that was not as obtrusive. And it would have been quite obtrusive if your 12 people that came across the river in your boat went out on the same carriage.
Yeah. And it's a lot. I guess that is true. Like, there are a lot of documentation of, like, stories of enslaved people and whatnot. So I think, but the ones that I hear are always trauma based, but I guess, like, there's a lot of all over the world, ugliness and anti-Blackness that has happened. And so therefore, of course, you're going to hear the trauma stories, because those, unfortunately, are the ones you hear the most stories of spirit, right? Because there's so many people who suffered, and they're, like, with the soldiers. That's why, you kind of, when you walk around, sometimes out of nowhere, and it could just be the oldness of the city, right? It could just be the fact that sometimes old places have funky smells. Maybe it's a whiff of, like, a spirit that has popped up. It could be a lot of things. But yeah, I think that, and I hate to say this, but I think to understand ghost stories is to understand trauma, and the belief that, like, if you experience enough terrible shit in your life, there's probably a part of you that, even if you don't want to be here, is going to stay, it seems, like.
Yeah, definitely. It does feel like there's definitely something to the idea of trauma that does really embed itself, whether as a residual or as an active. Like, it really does seem like those seem to be the biggest drivers of a spirit remaining. Like, very few are just happy-go-lucky.
Yeah. It's funny, because one thing that I do enjoy, to totally talk about a different city, but it's the one time I heard about a spirit just doing kind of cool things. Bridget Bishop, who was one of the women who was accused of witchcraft in Salem, she owned, like, a sort of like a bar. And I think that was sort of like a big reason. And I could be wrong, but this is what my tour guide told me. But she was, like, someone she owned sort of like a bar, and she wore colors. And people didn't like that, because they wanted women in their place at that time. As, like, I guess they still do. But, whatever. That is a whole nother tangent. But anyway, they say that her spirit just sort of roams, and sometimes you'll see, like, a red kind of, like, shadow, or someone wearing red. And she was always just in a good mood. But even her, even a happy ghost, she died in such a traumatic way, being accused of witchcraft. So, even if overwhelmingly they were a happy person, and they want to be attached to somewhere that gives them a little bit more joy. Even if it's a happy ghost, they probably had some very traumatic stuff happen, which in Bridget Bishop's case, she did.
Definitely. Yeah, no, I think a lot of spirits have that. Yeah. Like even, yeah, if they were happy, they still have that tragic ending. And that's the part where it's like they need that rectified, especially because she probably also felt it was unjust that she was killed because she wasn't a witch. She was just a woman trying to be a woman, running her own business, living her life and living her best life, not harming people. And then suddenly they're all like, "You're a witch. You don't do what we want you to do." Death.
Yeah. You won't fit in a box. It's all about fitting in boxes. And some of us just aren't meant to do that,
I don't think any of us are. And I think that's part of the thing that does cause us some form of harm, even if you don't recognize it as harm. It's because, we can be these lovely little people with different bits and pieces to us and still come together and be able to function together and do the things that we need to be people together. But there should also be able to be those parts where we can have our own little bits and pieces that are respected and loved.
Yeah, 100%.
Some of the bonus episodes you can hear at patreon.com/Haunted Hills are The People of the Roswell Incident, a live reading of The Vagabond on Walhalla, 1944 Yulon Bushfire and Royal Commission, The Policeman, Publican and Postman, Traralgon History, the second part to Rosedale True Crime, including a bushranger, The Tragic Architect, and much more, all relating to small towns with big stories. Thanks for listening. This was recorded on Gunai land in Moe, Victoria, who the traditional custodians of the Bachelong people. We respect their elders, past and present, and we hope for a positive future on all these lands where sovereignty was never ceded. Next time on Haunted Hills, you'll hear the history of Sale, Victoria. Meet the regular people, the butcher, the baker, and candlestick maker. Or whoever else we find. Stay safe, be kind.